From the very first verses of the book of Genesis, we are transported to the grand scene of creation, the formation of the universe, the earth, the animals, and finally, the human being, Adam, shaped from the dust, and Eve formed from his rib. It is a well-known narrative, told from generation to generation. But the more we read attentively, the more questions arise. One of them, deep and almost unsettling, echoes silently. What about the daughters of Adam and Eve? Why does almost no one talk about them? Why are their names not in the Bible? A fragment of creation that could change the way we understand the role of women in biblical history perhaps. In salvation itself, Genesis 5-4 gives us an enigmatic clue. After Seth was born, but it is Eve who appears as a companion, a suitable helper, not inferior, but complementary. The scene is set, a garden, a couple, a divine mission to be fruitful and multiply. We need to look carefully at Scripture itself. We need to ask, what does Genesis say, and what does it not say? Adam lived 800 years and had other sons and daughters. Why is the record of the first women of humanity so silent? After all, Genesis 5-4 states that Adam had sons and daughters, but that only raises more questions. Why are these daughters not named? After all, if they were there from the beginning, and if they were the ones who allowed the continuity of humanity, others claim it is a historical omission. Some affirm that these women were deliberately erased for theological or cultural reasons. We will explore apocryphal books and ancient traditions to try to hear the voices of those who, for some reason, were not recorded in the sacred pages. But to go beyond speculation, where can we seek answers? The answer may lie in the so-called apocryphal books, as well as in oral traditions preserved by ancient Jewish and Christian communities. Although these writings are not part of the biblical canon recognized by all churches, they carry important fragments of faith, culture, and worldview of ancient peoples, including about characters forgotten by the official narrative. We need to investigate other sources, ancient, forgotten, controversial sources that dared to name what the scriptures chose to silence. Why did they not even deserve a name? Why were their stories not told? Did they really exist? Or is the expression sons and daughters just a generalization? And if they existed, why did the sacred text remain silent about their identity? Cain and Abel, the first two named sons, appear on the scene. One becomes a farmer, the other a shepherd, mentioned in Joshua 10:13 and 2 Samuel 1:80, but not included in the Bible. In one of its medieval versions, this book gives names to the daughters of Adam and Eve. There, we read that Owain was the sister and wife of Cain, and Azurah was married to Seth. It is a surprising revelation. Proper names, personality. It is as if, suddenly, erased figures gain a face. And women Evan, if important, were often left out of the records. This does not mean they did not exist, but rather that their names were not preserved with the same care. And tragically, one kills the other. The first homicide stains the newly created earth, the most important elements to convey the story of salvation. That is why entire characters are ignored. Whole generations are summarized in one line, and female figures appear only when they play a decisive role in the plot. Cain flees, is cursed, and throughout the chapter, his lineage is briefly described. Later, Seth is born, the third named son, replacing Abel. One thing is certain. The Bible does not waste words. A search for answers. An attempt to understand what might have happened to these women forgotten by sacred history. We will explore not only the biblical text, but also ancient books, oral traditions, and apocryphal accounts. We will investigate what the ancient rabbis thought, what Ethiopian records say, and even what early Christians commented about these invisible daughters. Every detail carries weight. So, when something is mentioned so briefly like daughters and then ignored, it becomes a mystery, an invitation to question, a whisper that there is more behind the narrative than we can see at first reading. And even more, was this omission intentional? Is there something behind the veil, something forgotten or, perhaps deliberately left aside? Sons, and daughters. The phrase is clear, but strangely, none of them are mentioned by name. We know the names of Cain, Abel, and Seth, but we don't even know one female name among the first human beings. Doesn't that spark your curiosity? This absence does not seem like a simple detail. It raises a question that has spanned centuries of theological and historical debates. Whether you are a person of faith or a curious researcher, and here begins our journey. More than lost names, we are about to discover a hidden piece of humanity, and to start unraveling this enigma. In Genesis 1 and 2, we read about the creation of man and woman equal in dignity, created in the image of God. Adam names the animals. And then, in chapter 4, the story takes a dark turn. But in this whole process, birth, fall, flight, restoration, there is something that is not clearly said. Who are the wives of these sons? The most common answer among scholars and conservative theologians is direct. They married their sisters. It is necessary to understand the context in which the Bible was written. The ancient Hebrew tradition was strongly patriarchal. Genealogies were organized around men. Furthermore, the narrative of Genesis is not a complete biography of each person. It selects theologically and symbolically. Still, the silence about Adam's daughters cannot be completely ignored. It raises suspicion and opens space for deeper investigation. Some say the silence is intentional, and that is exactly what we will do next. As the canonical scriptures remain silent about the daughters of Adam and Eve, one of these texts is the Book of Jasher. In another ancient text, the Book of Jude, also known as the Little Genesis, there is a clear attempt to organize the events of creation and the first generations in more detail. In it, the daughters of Adam are named and described as fundamental members of the human lineage. The text even specifies dates and ages of marriage. In some accounts, Adam's daughters had distinct names and personalities, described as righteous, wise, or sometimes conflicted, depending on the version. This shows that the absence of their stories in the Bible does not mean they were forgotten by all cultures. As mothers of humanity, as transmitters of faith, culture, and hope. Role of Adam's daughters in creation and God's purpose. As part of the divine image God created in the beginning, male and female. In many contexts, they were preserved even if on the margins. What does that say about their role in God's plan? Showing an effort to legitimize these unions between siblings within a context of historical and divine necessity. Perhaps we do not need detailed accounts to perceive their importance. The text's silence may hide a greatness beyond historical record. God allowed what was provisional for life to flourish. And if there were women there, silent, anonymous, but present, then they were an essential part of the Creator's project. A silent, yet indispensable role. We need to look at the world around them. A world where, over time, other civilizations arose, and with them, others go further and question, could other human lineages have coexisted with Adam's, created separately? This is the so-called pre-Adamite theory, which suggests that God may have created other human beings before, or outside Eden, and that Adam and Eve represented only the chosen spiritual lineage, not the first humans in an absolute sense. New questions about who really existed in Cain and Seth's days, invisible to men, but eternal before God. Besides the written apocrypha, there are also the Midrashim rabbinic commentaries on biblical texts that sought to fill gaps left by the scriptures. This question unsettles the modern reader but must be understood in the creation context. At the beginning, humanity was still perfect. Without the genetic mutations and corruptions accumulated over generations, the union between siblings at that time did not carry the same ethical and biological weight it would today. It was an initial necessity for the fulfillment of God's plan. The inevitable question is, what role did they have in God's plan? Be fruitful and multiply, fill the earth, and subdue it. The focus was on patriarchal lines, wars, male genealogies. After killing Abel and being expelled from God's presence, went to live in the land of Nod, and there met his wife and built a city. But wait, where did these people come from? If until then, only Adam, Eve, and their children existed, how did Cain find a wife and build a city? Is the text suggesting that other people already inhabited the earth? Women often remained at the margins of the texts, although central in everyday and spiritual life. It is no coincidence that the New Testament values women often omitted by the Old. Mary Magdalene, Anna, Priscilla, Lydia, women who, even in hostile contexts, played decisive roles in the redemption plan. This divine command was given not only to Adam but to both. Eve, and consequently her daughters, received from God a shared mission to bring forth life, care for creation, and actively participate in humanity's expansion and civilization building. We are not just talking about biological unions necessary for species multiplication. Women who conceived and raised children in a still young, wild world without defined social structures. They taught the first words, prepared the first foods, cared for the first illnesses. The female womb not only gave birth to life but sustained the future of creation. But why was this role not more detailed? We are talking about identity, mission, purpose. After all, God created humans, male and female, in his image. Would he not have assigned the woman a role as fundamental as the man's from the beginning? In many of these oral accounts, the rabbis openly discussed the wives of Cain and Seth, suggesting that they were indeed sisters, but with an important role in humanity's development. These traditions do not treat these women as mere decorative or biological figures. They were active parts of God's plan, even if ignored by the main text. There are even records in ancient Islamic traditions that echo these ideas. But why were these texts left out of the official canon? Partly because many arose centuries after the original biblical books and contained mythological, symbolic, or contradictory elements to central doctrines. Whether Awan and Azur really existed or represent symbolic figures matters little to the spiritual impact of the reflection. What matters is that these traditions reveal a deep desire to rescue the feminine from history's shadow, partly because the theological tradition that consolidated the Bible preferred to focus on a male and redemptive narrative line. What did not fit this was left out. Still, these forgotten echoes invite us to reconsider our view of humanity's beginnings. These sources not only name women, the Bible did not name, they recognize them as protagonists. And if these women were indeed as essential as the men at humanity's origin, that is the question, leading us to the next chapter. What was the true if ancient traditions point to the existence of Adam's daughters? Genesis 1:28 gives us a clue. God blessed them and said to them, Adam's daughters were very likely the first mothers in history. Part of the answer lies in how the ancients recorded history. And if the same pattern applies to Adam's daughters, there is also an inevitable moral debate. Did the first marriages involve siblings? And if so, how did God allow it? Instead of judging, we should reverently look at the mystery of origins. Now, having understood the role of these women in creation, one of the greatest surprises in reading Genesis carefully is the mention that Cain. Some scholars propose that these other peoples were descendants, not directly mentioned, such as Adam and Eve's own daughters, and that, over time, generations multiplied in parallel. Regardless of the theory adopted, the text of Genesis does not detail these issues. It remains wrapped in mystery and, perhaps intentionally so. But what matters here is that, whether among Adam's descendants or other peoples, women were present. In many ancient civilizations, women were made invisible in historical records. In royal lineages of Egypt, for example, women ruled as pharaohs, but their names were erased from monuments by succeeding men. In Mesopotamian tribes, kings' wives held essential religious functions, but their names rarely appear on clay tablets. And this leads us to an important conclusion. They may have been forgotten by men, but not by God. We notice a curious pattern. God tends to value what the world despises, while men exalt kings, armies, and great deeds, but God never ignored them. He saw each one, heard every cry in childbirth, witnessed every tear shed, every effort to feed a child, every silent prayer amid the chaos of a world newly emerged from Eden. Sustain history behind the scenes. God chooses shepherds, barren women, simple fishermen, orphans, foreigners, and, why not, forgotten daughters? Voiceless, erased by time, society, or even family. Now that we know God does not ignore the forgotten, we can understand what the Bible really teaches us about Adam's sons and daughters, and how this still affects our families today. This chapter is not just about women of the past, it is about all who have ever felt invisible, disposable, or ignored. The message is simple and powerful. God sees you, God knows you, God has not forgotten you. You knit me together in my mother's womb. Your eyes saw my unformed body. We will find interesting and even surprising clues about Adam's sons and daughters. The key text is Genesis 5-4, which says, if this is true and it is, then it also applies to women of antiquity. Over 800 years, the original couple had many other descendants, among them, daughters. God saw them. God honored them, even if men did not. And that is exactly what we will reflect on in the next chapter, participating in the formation of cities, families, and cultures. And, once again, this pattern is not exclusive to the Bible. Everyone called her barren, but God saw her as the mother of a prophet. Think of Esther, a young orphan, invisible to the powerful but essential to God's plan to save a nation. Think of Mary, an anonymous peasant chosen to carry the Savior of the world. He taught women, talked with Samaritan women, forgave adulteresses, healed hemorrhaging women, and praised widows. Society wanted to silence them, but he called them by name. The Bible itself, when it once, breaks this pattern. They may not have received names in Scripture's pages, but they received identity in God's heart. And throughout history, God kept raising women to show he forgets no one. Jesus, for example, includes women in his genealogy, women who were not perfect, nor always socially accepted. Tamar, Rahab, Ruth. This shows that God's plan never excluded women, even when men did. Even in later biblical genealogies, who lived in a time without writing, temples, or religious laws, then he also does not forget you, such as those of Abraham or the kings of Israel. Most names are male. Women are mentioned only when they played an essential role in the unfolding of the divine covenant, like Sarah, Rebecca, Ruth, or Mary. The erasure, therefore, does not mean absence, but a cultural and religious choice to record only what was considered a priority within a patriarchal context. But there is something powerful hidden here. Returning to Adam's daughters, if they really existed, as apocrypha and ancient traditions affirm, and if they were mothers, educators, and sustainers of the first civilization, then humanity owes them not only its biological continuity, but also its cultural and spiritual heritage. Their stories may not have been written on papyri or tablets, but they were lived, day after day, in the world's first steps. When we look at the Bible as a whole, Adam and Eve's daughters may have been erased from official records. In Psalm 139, David declares something powerful. For you created my inmost being, and there is more. Jesus himself, when he came into the world, broke the patriarchal logic of his time. This divine paternity name, what the world forgets, helps us look at Adam's daughters with new eyes. Think of Hannah, Samuel's mother. Each of these stories echoes the truth we seek to recover here. God never forgets anyone. And this leads us to a profound reflection. If God did not forget Adam's daughters, How many people live today feeling nameless? As we close this chapter, we are ready to take a step further. If we set aside traditions and historical silences for a moment and go directly back to the Bible, in the days of Adam, after he fathered Seth, were 800 years, and he had other sons and daughters. This phrase, though brief, is deeply revealing. It shows us that Cain, Abel, and Seth were not Adam and Eve's only children. But why did they not receive names? The most likely answer is cultural and contextual. Ancient Hebrew tradition, like many other patriarchal cultures, they reveal something important. Since ancient times, there was awareness that Adam's daughters existed, and that they had fundamental roles in humanity as continuity, prioritized male lineage for reasons of inheritance, tribe, and messianic descent. Women were almost always mentioned only when they played a decisive role in the story, which we find echoes of this early story. The presence and relevance of these women, one question remains: why are they not more remembered? What did history do to them? And what does that teach us about our society even today? In practically all past civilizations, the female role was essential but almost always invisible to written history. The Bible was written in a patriarchal context. This was true for Sarah, Rebecca, Rachel, Deborah, Ruth, Esther, and Mary, among others. But even these great women were mentioned selectively. In contrast to the multitude of others who lived, loved, bore children, worked, suffered, and were forgotten, where lineage was traced through the father, inheritance passed through the son, and deeds of war, leadership, and priesthood. The simple fact that the Bible says Adam had sons and daughters is a crack, a fissure in the wall of oblivion, a chance to rescue from anonymity those whom history tried to erase. They represent not only the original generation but also the crowd of women who supported humanity in the shadows, without public recognition. He spoke with the Samaritan woman, forgave the adulteress, resurrected Jairus' daughter, healed the woman with the bleeding disorder, was anointed by Mary, and appeared first to women after the resurrection. He restored the feminine dignity, forgotten since Eden. Seth is described as the one who called on the name of the Lord. It can be an invitation to remember, reflect, and value what has been ignored for centuries. What does all this have to do with us today? How can this ancient story transform the way we see the present? Perhaps the purpose of this forgetting is not to leave us in ignorance, but to provoke us to rediscover the beauty and importance of what has remained hidden. We realize that even in its silence, the Bible raises powerful questions. Why do we tend to value only the big names, the heroic deeds, the public figures? And what about those who hold everything together in silence? The ones who get no credit, but are essential? A question continues to echo like a forgotten whisper in the pages of the Bible. Why were Adam and Eve's daughters forgotten? Why don't we have more details about them? Names, stories, deeds, or even a more elaborate mention? How can the forgotten story of Adam and Eve's daughters change my life? The answer might surprise you. This is not just a narrative from the past. It's a mirror of the present. It's a lens to see the faults, omissions, and patterns that keep repeating, in society, in faith, and within ourselves. Suggesting his lineage was marked by God-fearing people, including possibly faithful wives who influenced future generations, even if unnamed in records. Loud and dominant. How many mothers, daughters, wives, and spiritual leaders have been omitted from the narrative for not fitting the male protagonism model, and ignore what is discreet, silent, and essential? The forgetting of Adam's daughters is a symbol of this imbalance, and makes us reflect on how much we still repeat this pattern today. At first glance, does not seem to have been the case for these early daughters. However, there are extra-canonical traditions and ancient Jewish sources that tried to fill these gaps. Texts, like the Book of Jubilees and the Book of Adam and Eve, which are not canonical but were read by many ancient Jews and Christians. The Old Testament frequently omits women from genealogical records. So when the author of Genesis makes a point to write sons and daughters, it is because he recognized their existence and importance, even if he did not name them. Give names such as Awan and Azura, supposedly daughters of Adam. One married Cain, the other Seth. While we cannot affirm these details as biblical doctrine, but essential for the structure to stand, another important detail is that the very fact the Bible mentions sons and daughters is significant. Moreover, when looking at Seth's genealogy, which leads to Noah and then Abraham, here is the great lesson. The Bible does not intend to tell the whole story, but rather the story necessary to reveal God's plan. And within that plan, Adam's daughters fulfilled their mission silently, leaving traces of faith, motherhood, effort, and humanity. They are like the beams of a house, invisible to those who enter. Now that we understand that the scriptures acknowledge, however briefly, at this point in the story, the most likely answer lies in how ancient cultures treated women. This pattern caused women to be rarely recorded in detail, unless they played key roles in the divine plan or Israel's national narratives. Adam and Eve's daughters were among the first to be silenced. This silence is not just a historical detail. It became a reflection of something much greater: humanity's tendency to value what is visible, How many women's stories have been erased? But there is something powerful in silence. Sometimes what is not said shouts louder than 1,000 words. And when we look to the New Testament, we see that Jesus, the second Adam, gave voice to women. Thus, the silence surrounding Adam and Eve's daughters need not be a full stop. And with this understanding, we arrive at the final moment of this journey. Maybe you're wondering, what does all this have to do with me? Diving into this mystery. Adam's daughters represent all the forgotten ones in history, the anonymous people who live behind the scenes, the ones who don't appear in books but kept humanity alive. They teach us about the importance of what is unseen. Are we truly giving space for all to be heard? Are we not, even unknowingly, repeating the pattern of silencing certain voices out of tradition, prejudice, or neglect? About the value of the invisible. He said, "The last shall be first, the least are the greatest, and whoever wants to lead must serve." It's a call, an invitation to remember the forgotten, to honor those who walk beside us, even if they never appear in the spotlight. How many incredible people pass through your life every day, without a name, without a stage, without recognition? How many silent stories are being written right now, by hands the world does not see, but heaven deeply valued? It's a reminder that God's kingdom is made of living stones. Maybe you will never preach from a pulpit, never publish a book, never have a famous channel, but if your life is in God's hands, nothing is in vain. Many of them anonymous to human eyes, but precious to the Creator's. You too carry a calling, even if no one sees it yet. Heaven doesn't need celebrities, it needs the faithful. He rescued the value of what the world ignores, including the value of forgotten women. Write in the comments, and together, let's honor those who walk quietly, the mother who prays for her children. May you see the scriptures with new eyes. May you notice what once went unnoticed, and may you understand that, in God's kingdom, nothing is insignificant, and no one is forgotten. The wife who holds the home together, the daughter who sacrifices, the servant whom no one notices. Moreover, this story speaks to you who may feel voiceless, forgotten, that your name isn't in the spotlight of life, that no one recognizes your effort, your pain, your journey. Know this, God sees what the world ignores. The heavens record what the earth undervalues. Hidden in the Bible's margins have something to teach us. Then your life also carries eternal value, even if no one has yet told your story. Your name may be hidden from human records, but it is engraved in God's hands. This reflection also challenges storytellers, pastors, teachers, content creators, leaders, and parents. Jesus taught us to overturn orders. That's why this story is more than a biblical curiosity. And finally, it's a message of hope. If even Adam's daughters, may this journey serve as an awakening. Now that you know this forgotten story, pause for a moment. Look around. Adam and Eve's daughters may never have been named on the Bible's main pages, but their lives made an eternal impact. You are part of this story. So here's the challenge. Start seeing value in what seems small. Honor the invisible around you. Give voice to those who have never been heard. And never forget, what men don't tell, God preserves. If this message touched you, share it with someone who needs to be reminded of their worth. And now I want to hear from you. Who is the most invisible, yet most valuable person you know? Until the next video, may the God who sees the forgotten also see you and strengthen you.